Welcome to the One Stop Crop Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things farming, conservation, and the environment right here in Sandusky County. Welcome to One Stop Crop, your one-stop shop podcast for all things farming, conservation, and the environment here in Sandusky County. I'm here with Sarah Schott, a wildlife communications specialist from the Ohio Division of Wildlife. Why don't you introduce yourself, Sarah?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. My name is Sarah, and I am a wildlife communications specialist in our Northwest Ohio region. So I cover 20 Northwest Ohio counties in that far northwest corner of Ohio, going all the way up to Michigan, all the way to the Indiana border. And I do a lot of education, outreach, and that sort of thing. So going into schools and doing programming, but also working with our media, anything that has to do with public outreach and getting the knowledge out there about hunting, fishing, wildlife, birding, anything to do with exploring the outdoors. And I work for the Ohio Division of Wildlife, which is a state wildlife agency. So there's a lot of different organizations that a lot of folks will get kind of confused about per se. So the easiest way to understand it is most of us have heard of ODNR before, or Ohio Department of Natural Resources. And that is kind of like our big umbrella agency. So that is our, big natural resources agency in Ohio, and the governor will appoint our director. So our director is Director Mary Mertz right now, and she oversees all of the ODNR operations. Underneath that ODNR umbrella are several different divisions. So one of those is the Division of Wildlife, which is who I work for and represent. But then we also have ones that most folks have heard of. So we have a State Parks and Watercraft. So those are the folks who are managing all of our wonderful state parks and our campgrounds like East Harbor and Maumee Bay, a lot of those wonderful places. So that is its own division. Division of Wildlife does not maintain or operate our state parks. Our Division of Wildlife is focused on exactly what it sounds like, so our wildlife species. So we are the state wildlife agency in Ohio in charge of managing our wildlife species, but also enforcing our hunting, fishing, and trapping laws. So we set those, and then our biologists set those laws, and then our wildlife officers, or some people might refer to them as game wardens, they're the ones that are enforcing those laws. So that's kind of the little bit of a difference there. We do own property that a lot of folks have probably heard of before. Just our properties are called wildlife areas. So as opposed to state parks, they are a little bit less developed. So maybe not designated walking paths. Most of them don't have restrooms, that sort of thing. They're meant to be wildlife habitat first. So some in Sandusky County, that a lot of folks, if you drive on Route 6, you're driving past it, whether you know or not. But Pickle Creek Wildlife Area is a large one in Sandusky County. And then in this area too, we have McGee Marsh Wildlife Area, which is our one exception, is that it is a huge visitor area. Yeah. We do have a visitor center, but that is kind of our exception of our wildlife areas. Most of them are going to be just wild places for our wildlife to thrive.
So you don't cover the National Wildlife Refuge for Ottawa. Yeah, yes. Is it Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge? Okay, because I know that's along the same strip. Yeah, I was just curious about that one.
That one is a place that people get confused about too. That is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay. So you kind of have tiers, is what I describe to people. Is you have your bigger tier is your federal level, so you have your U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they have National Wildlife Refuges. Ottawa is the only one that we have in Ohio. And it goes for this is the same kind of strategy for all states, but focusing on Ohio. Then you have your state wildlife agency. So you have the Division of Wildlife, that is our regulating wildlife and fish agency. And then on a regional basis, you have your Metro Park system. So you might have Erie Metro Parks or Metro Parks Toledo. You have this regional basis where some people might think Howard Marsh Metro Park. That is a Metro Park property. Yeah. Not owned by the feds, not owned by the state. That's a Metro Park regional. Yeah. And then you'll have your counties, so like our county soil and waters, our county park districts. So folks might be familiar with Blue Heron Nature Preserve or Ringneck Ridge. Those are going to be owned by Sandusky County Park District. Okay. Yeah. And then even, depends on how big your cities are, but even your cities might have their own
parks and stuff.
Yeah, park and recreation department. Yeah. Usually we see those with bigger cities, but you may even have the city. So you have these different silos. They all work together, but they're different. They're owned and operated by different people.
Even in our office, we have us which is county, state, kind of, and then we also have like federal with NRCS. So
Yeah.
there's all that stuff even in our office as well. All right, so first question I have is what makes Ohio's wildlife unique compared to other states around us? And then how has the landscape of Ohio shaped the types of animals that live here?
Yeah, we have actually quite a variety of habitats and wildlife species that we don't always think about, especially if you're just looking at a snapshot of what Northwest Ohio looks like today. You might just see, cornfields, soybean fields, and like deer, and that's it. But we have quite a robust variety of habitats and wildlife. So this region especially used to be the Great Black Swamp, which if you're from Northwest Ohio, you've heard of it, or you've even seen company names are named after Great Black Swamp or something along that line. So that's a deep-rooted part of our history here. But if you go into southern Ohio, you have the unglaciated region of Ohio where you have rolling hills and extensive forests and things like that. So you get a good variety of some different wildlife species. Our resident species, also our non-resident migratory species. Like in spring, we have the warbler migration, so that literally draws people from across the world. My running joke is Northwest Ohio is warblers and walleye. We have people come to see our warblers in the spring, and then we have people come to see or come to fish for walleye all summer long, and it's even getting more popular too with ice fishing in the winter if we do have a good ice year. But so we have a lot of those landscapes, but our area in Northwest Ohio hasn't always, looked like what it looks like today, and it's actually gone through a really rich history. And the Great Black Swamp was actually the last wilderness in Ohio. So this corner of the state was the last part of Ohio to, quote unquote, be settled, or really have those European settlers coming and building homes and cutting down trees and creating farmland. This was the last place that people came.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I know they basically drain the whole Black Swamp. Is there any of it remaining anywhere?
So there is one small fragment, and it's escaping me. I think it's a nature preserve somewhere outside of Toledo, and right now that it might be Kitty Todd. I'm not positive, but there is one. I have not been there myself, but there is apparently one last remaining small fragment, or maybe there might be a handful, but there's not many. And what folks think a lot when they hear, the Great Black Swamp and it was a giant wetland, they think that wetland looked like what our wetlands look like in Northwest Ohio now. So if you picture Pickerel Creek Wildlife Area or McGee Marsh Wildlife Area or Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and you picture those diked in wetlands with some emergent vegetation, but not a lot of trees, not a lot of woody vegetation and deep pooling and things like that, that is not what our Great Black Swamp looked like. So when I'm talking to little kids, I say, who's seen Princess and the Frog? Yeah. And that is the type of wetland that this area once was. It was a bottomland wetland. It was a forested wetland that now when we think of those types of wetlands, we think the Deep South. And we think those, we have large, massive trees growing in that area. So this area used to be a large forested wetland, about almost the size of the state of Connecticut. So really large, huge area. And the wildlife that lived here was a lot different than what we see now. But with the restoration of a lot of our wetlands, even though they look different, they're bringing back habitat. They're providing a lot more habitats to some of those wildlife species that had lost that, in the mid to late 1800s.
Yeah, I know. Unless I'm misremembering, I think McGee Marsh, the Nature Center, or is it the Visitor Center there?
Yeah.
It got newly redone and kind of has a really good visual of what the Great Black Swamp used to look like.
Yes.
I think on the bottom level, and then you can see all of the different wildlife that was there.
Yeah.
And kind of that, I guess, Princess and the
Frog representation,
which is honestly that's a really good visual for how to explain how it looked, and stuff. I know. I think even at the Nature Center or the Welcome Center, whatever it actually is called. they were talking about how, like, wagon wheels would just get stuck, and then they would just have to leave stuff, and that's why eventually we built, like, the roads and like, drained it for, like, farmland and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has an awesome history.
Yeah.
And if you are a history nerd and you like history, I love history. I love American history and Ohio history. There's some really cool books and accounts on what these people experienced. And it's one of my favorite things to talk about, just being from Northwest Ohio, and telling this story to a lot of people that really don't fully comprehend. But it was a horrible place to live. Like, people hated it here, and the settlers are constantly writing how miserable it is, and that it's full of mosquitoes, which I guess not much has really changed there. We still have a lot of mosquitoes, but like, it's just full of mosquitoes, and everyone's getting what at that time what they called the shakes, which we now know as malaria. But they would just start convulsing and shaking, and then they were dying of malaria, and they just described it as this horrible place to live, and no one actually really wanted to live here. There were some Native American tribes that, when you get to the heart of the Great Black Swamp, they were moving in and out of the Great Black Swamp.
Yeah.
They weren't as much living in the heart of it. They were going in and hunting and then going back to higher ground, kind of to really where they were living. But they were, living here a little bit. But as far as our settlers, when they started coming to this region, and you get those people from Europe, if they wanted to go to Michigan, they went south and around.
Yeah.
They went south, then they dipped over to Indiana, and then they were kind of looping up around into Michigan. They didn't want to travel through. But there were some people that, as you said, like, they did, and they would get stuck. And it's really a fun story. But they would try to travel through, and eventually, like, moving into the early 1800s, 1820s, 1830s, they started building what's called the Maumee and Western Reserve Road.
Yeah.
And that road now follows Route 20. So it's almost like portions of Route 20 are the Western Reserve Road. And it was a really crude road, really muddy, really, like, terrible road, and they would get stuck. So every, family, they'd come by on their wagon with their team of horse or oxen, and they were traveling a mile per day is how far they were going. They were going a mile per day.
Which is it's just crazy. That's really slow.
Yeah, it's just when you think about that, and you spent all day, that's all you try to do.
Just for a mile.
And so every mile along the Maumee and Western Reserve Road, or what's now Route 20, there was a tavern or like a bed and breakfast type thing. So and these are like really brave people that are doing this because nobody wanted to live here, but there are some people who, want to live here, and they're operating like a tavern or a bed and breakfast, whatever you kind of want to picture in your mind. And they had every mile along the road because they knew about a mile is as far as people can go. So the road was about 31 miles long, so there's 31 taverns at that time, on every mile. And then they were housing and feeding and like offering those people some sort of relief who were trying to travel through this area. And then they were passing through and stopping at the next tavern, and they would help pull people out. And this road was, some settlers write that it was the worst road in America, and it kind of earned the nickname the Mud Pike Road. And but over the next several decades, especially in 1859, Ohio passed the Ohio Ditch Law, which started the digging of ditches and draining the swamp. So it lasted I think 20, 30 years before you could kind of say the swamp was pretty much drained and all those trees were cut down. But by that point in time, the swamp is getting drained, that road is getting better, it's easier to travel, where there's not as much of this mud to get stuck in, and those taverns are slowly going out of business. Yeah. And I always say it's good old American ingenuity. Nothing's going to stop people from coming up with some crazy ideas. And so these taverns were losing business, and so they would it was a children's job, because everybody had like 10 or 12 kids, and the kids would go haul water from the local creek or river or stream. They would haul water and they would throw it on their section of the road because it was still a dirt road. So they'd wet down their section, to make this really mud hole so that people would come by and they'd get stuck, and then they'd charge them money to pull out. You
gotta stay here.
Yeah, so it's crazy. But I always tell the kids too, I'm like, the only reason, these folks, maybe they knew this at the time, they didn't, but the only reason that works is because this area was a wetland. And we look around, we still see that today, right? Yeah. You get a big rain, and then you see our crop fields, you see them hold that water, and that's because of the soil that's here. It's, you know, it's always going to have that characteristic of being a wetland. So it's always going to get muddy, and that clay is always going to get, you know, hold that water really well. But yeah, it's just some really cool, awesome history.
Yeah. So like by the late, you'd say like 1800s, the vast majority of the swamp was like drained and stuff.
Drained and because again, this is a forested area, so drained for the most part, like a huge series of ditches. A lot of those ditches are, you know, they follow the same path that we have today. And then all of those trees are also cut down. Yeah. So they did build, obviously they built, you know, log cabins and things out of those trees. Some of those trees were sent overseas. They were sent back to European countries. And that's actually where Oak Harbor gets its name from. Because they were shipping oak trees out of Oak Harbor. And they were actually sending them back to the East Coast, and sometimes I think across the Atlantic Ocean, to make ships out of these oak trees. And we actually don't have super great records of what trees were here because no one wanted to live here. And when they were here, they weren't focused on keeping great records. So that is one of the ways that we do know that oak was here, because of those records of shipping out oaks and Oak Harbor getting its name. But they don't have fantastic records on other tree species. We kind of just assume they were those water-loving tree species like elm, ash, cottonwood, those type of things. And then we, oak trees, probably your swamp oaks and things like that. But they don't have fantastic records. But yeah, at that point, all those trees are cut down. But a majority of those trees were burned. So they were just thrown into a pile, burn them, because they were trying to clear this land as fast as possible.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's muddy for so long, you're just like, I gotta get rid of it.
Yeah.
But then we have like really rich farmland because of the area and everything, which is really good for us nowadays too. So it's kind of like I don't know. It's an interesting situation in how this area has evolved.
Yeah.
So next question I have is, so in terms of the Great Black Swamp and stuff, were there any like really surprising species there that people wouldn't necessarily expect to find in Ohio? And then are some of those species still here today or coming back today? Or basically, are there any species in Ohio that are, I guess, odd to be here? What you wouldn't expect?
Yeah, things that you're not gonna think of, you know, in 2026. We used to have these in Ohio hundreds of years ago. So kind of speaking for like the Great Black Swamp, but most of Ohio, so a lot of wildlife that we had in this area was found throughout the state, with some exceptions. But you know, we had deer and turkey, and historically we had those animals. But in Ohio during that time, and before a lot of people started coming here, and you know, we had millions and millions of people living in Ohio, we had mountain lions, we had gray wolf, we had elk, we had bison. Our species of elk and bison were actually not the species that you think of today. They were actually a different subspecies. So it was an eastern elk, and then more like a woodland bison, because again, you're thinking Ohio is 95% forest, you know, around the 1800s area, 1700s, 1800s, 95% forest. So we have like a more of a woodland bison that isn't as much as like the out west type of prairie bison that you're thinking now.
Yeah.
But we had those animals here. We had a few animals actually go extinct in the state. So relatively, you know, in relative terms, not long ago, we used to have what's called a passenger pigeon and a Carolina parakeet. And actually the last, both of those species in the world died in Ohio. They both died in Cincinnati Zoo.
And also, I think I was looking at your like notes that you sent me, also the same enclosure,
cage.
The same clay cage.
The exact same cage.
Crazy.
Yeah, I did a deep dive recently, again, because I like history, and you know, with like America 250, it just seems like everything right now is history related. And so was learning a little bit more about this, and our last passenger pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914, and then 4 years later in the exact same cage, the last Carolina parakeet. His name was Incas, and then the last passenger pigeon, her name was Martha. Most people, like if you're into conservation, you know a lot about wildlife conservation, you've heard of Martha, probably the last passenger pigeon. And she is in the Smithsonian in DC, in the Natural History Museum. But these birds, especially the passenger pigeons, were super prevalent. So passenger pigeons, they're described as billions of them in one flock. And they're pretty similar to what you would look like at a rock pigeon today, like similar in size, a combination of like a mourning dove and a pigeon, but not either one of those, a completely different species. And they were, billions and billions of them were in Ohio and across the eastern United States. And several journal accounts, I believe it was Audubon, described one of them as when these passenger pigeons decided to migrate, because they were kind of like a local migrant almost, like they didn't migrate to really like South America, like we don't think of them like that. They just migrated throughout the United States and maybe into Central America. But they would be in these giant flocks, and when they decided they were leaving this area, maybe they're leaving this what's now Sandusky County, they would get up and they would fly and they would block out the sun. That's
it would like literally be an eclipse.
Yeah, it was an eclipse in the middle of the day with birds.
Yeah.
Which if you saw the solar eclipse, when was that? 2 years ago or so?
Yeah, in like April of 24. Yeah, or something like that.
And you like have that experience and you see that. Like for me, I saw that with my eyes, and then I immediately thought, they experience this with birds, and not just for a handful of minutes. They experience this hours at a time,
and like consistently, like every year.
Yeah,
every time
just happened.
They chose to migrate,
which is just crazy. And so these people are seeing that many birds, and they are just thinking it's impossible that these birds are ever going to go extinct or disappear. That's not possible. And so they would shoot them, they'd harvest them. They were a great source of protein. They're a pigeon, so we don't think of pigeons and think that they're like really strong, tough animals. They're pretty they're pretty wimpy. So they were pretty easy for them to harvest, and because they were in such big flocks, they would fire once or twice, and they would get a lot of them in one shot. And so they were harvesting them as food to eat. They were also selling them in the wild game market at that time. And then they were also heavily reliant on trees. So they were only found in forests. And then we started cutting down a lot of our trees. And at one point, we had only had 10% of Ohio was forest. We went from 95 to 10%. And so that took huge toll habitat loss-wise on these passenger pigeons. And by the late 1800s, they were pretty much disappearing across all of the eastern United States. And they, by the late 1800s, there were people that were they were recognizing what was happening, and they were trying to kind of save the last bit of them, even though at that point it's kind of like it's a lost cause for the most part. But they were actually offering rewards for the live capture of these birds to like take them to places like the Cincinnati Zoo and try to preserve them. Obviously that didn't really work very well. But the last documented, I should say, wild passenger pigeon that was shot was in 1900, and that was also in Ohio. So again, the last wild passenger pigeon like in the United States, in the world,
was in Ohio.
Was in Pike County, and then they were like offering rewards for those live passenger pigeons, and nobody ever found any after that point in time. And then they had a small group of them in the Cincinnati Zoo, and that last one, Martha, died in 1914. And the Carolina parakeet kind of has a similar story, although from what I can tell is their numbers weren't as large. There were still flocks of them, but they weren't blocking out the sun or anything like that. And they were a little bit more of a southern species, like southern Ohio. Maybe they would come up to northern Ohio, but not as prevalent as southern Ohio. And they were also overhunted, but for a completely different purpose. So they were actually hunted for their feathers. So they're a neon green, yellow bird, and around this same time is what we call the plume trade. And so if you were a wealthy woman, you had a fancy hat that had all sorts of beautiful bird feathers in it. And sometimes even fully mounted birds. Like there's pictures of these Carolina parakeets fully mounted on a hat that a lady in New York City is wearing and walking around the city. That's how you showed off your wealth.
That's wild.
Which is crazy.
That's wild.
So these birds were overhunted, and they were, probably eating the protein from these birds, but they were mostly hunting them for their feathers to taxidermy them for this plume trade for wealthy people to wear on their hats. So, and that drove them into extinction. So pretty same story there, but out of those stories, we learn from our mistakes. And specifically out of the Carolina parakeet and other animal or other birds that were affected by that, the most notable ones were kind of the egrets, so great egrets and then great blue herons. They were affected a lot because they have those really long, like flowy white feathers or bluish tinted feathers. And then we had the Lacey Act passed, which basically prohibited the selling and the trade of those birds, and then other wildlife as well. But it was really targeted towards those birds to curb that trade and save what animals we had left.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I guess kind of connecting to this, what are the biggest threats to Ohio's wildlife today when it comes to, there was obviously stuff in the past that happened, and then when I was thinking about a bird that has gone extinct, the passenger pigeon is probably like the poster child, you'd say, for that. Because it was just so many, and then it went so little, and then within the span of half a century, even less than that, they just went from billions to none, to gone.
It is the if you I graduated from Ohio State with a wildlife management degree, and then everybody else that kind of has that sort of background has heard the story of the passenger pigeon, and they do it is the poster child. It is the poster child for a bad way. It's like the infamous story of what not to do, right? So it's telling us this is what we managed to do. We had the most prolific bird species in the world, and it's gone. And so that's the focus on how we do things today, and making sure that we're not having that story.
I guess it just shows how much power us humans have on a specific species. The fact that we were able to, it's a horrible word, but eradicate an entire species that easily in that amount of time is just horrible.
It is. When you really take that time to process it, you think about what you said, what impact can we have, positive or negative, and then it's a humbling experience of we have done terrible things like that to our wildlife populations, but we also have the possibility of doing so much good and doing so much better to reestablish and reintroduce some of these species that we lost.
I guess what laws do we have in place that also kind of goes with the biggest threats, because I know a lot of threats could be us and stuff, but what laws are in place to kind of prevent stuff like the passenger pigeon for not happening again?
So that early 1900s, that was kind of our low point, and then that kickstarted the passage of a lot of laws. So we have that Lacey Act passed in 1900. That was kind of the first big one. That was a turning point, so to speak. And then around that time, in the decades to follow, wild game markets were eliminated, which also is a big one, because up until that point, people are harvesting ducks and turkey and deer, and they're selling them for profit. Especially birds, especially waterfowl is being, actually in this area particularly, has a long history of waterfowl hunting. And we would market hunt waterfowl, and then actually it all got shipped to New York City. And so eventually that game market is eliminated. It's illegal now. Anywhere in the United States you can't sell wild game. So that's really important, and that falls into what we call our North American model of conservation. And there's 7 tenets, and one of those tenets is, direct words, elimination of wild game market. So you can no longer do that. There are people, obviously, we eat walleye and we enjoy yellow perch dinners. There are commercial fisheries. They have permitting. That is a different story. The gist is you can't go out in October, harvest a deer.
You can't do it
and take it to somebody and sell it. Right?
You can't do it basically on your own. If you go through specific legal channels
Yes.
to do it.
There are
you
legal regulated channels for that.
Yeah.
And for some species, you can't even do that.
Yeah.
Like there's some species that you can do that, there's some species that you can't. So that is the big one. And then as you get later into the 1900s, you start seeing the Clean Water Act passed.
Yeah.
So now we're recognizing we have a water pollution, and that's passed. Again, Ohio, like it or not, I guess, we're the poster child for a lot of bad things
We really are.
that happened. But we had the Cuyahoga River catch on fire several times. It caught on fire, I think, like a dozen times or so. They don't even know. I don't even know if they know exactly. But it wasn't the first time it caught on fire, but finally, after several times, it caught on fire, and Time magazine covered it. And then everybody around the nation is thinking, what's going on over there? Like, this is really bad.
Yeah.
So the Clean Water Act is passed. EPA is established pretty much as a direct result of that publicity. So you have those things happening. And then you also, in Ohio and other states as well, each state has a regulatory agency. So as we talked about in the beginning, Ohio Division of Wildlife. So we're enforcing those game laws.
Yeah.
So if you're going hunting, again, you're not selling wild game, but you also have to have a hunting license. You also have to have a deer permit. You have to go through hunter education. So you have all of these steps in place to make sure everything going on is ethical and legal and responsible. But then you also have to pay for these things. So you have to pay for a hunting license and a deer permit. And there's even an excise tax on ammunition and guns that's earmarked for conservation. So all of that money comes back right into conservation. It doesn't go to, fix roads or things like that. It comes right back into conservation, and it protects those same animals that are being harvested, but also our endangered species.
Yeah.
And so that is part of that model, that North American model of conservation. And it's a great system that really feeds back into itself, and you're ethically harvesting from the population, but you're also sustaining it at the exact same time.
Yeah. So when it comes to hunting, is it kind of like, well, I guess you said sustaining, but is it kind of balancing out populations in a way so one population doesn't go crazy and then disrupt the whole natural flow of things?
Yes. So again, thinking about 200 years ago, what this place looked like, we have mountain lions and we have wolves. We have those really large predators that are keeping our deer population in check. Deer are the best example to use for this. Yeah. So you have mountain lions, you have wolves that are controlling the deer population. You have, European settlers and Native Americans, but they're not managing that population, right? That is a check and balance through nature. Yeah. You eliminate those predators and now they're gone, and then we've changed the habitat, so you have opened up more opportunity for the deer to grow too much, but also not regulate itself. Yeah. So we have coyotes, which we actually didn't used to have coyotes in Ohio. They are native to the western United States. Yeah. They moved here, I think, in the early 1900s.
I didn't actually know that. I thought they were like native, and I was like, oh, apparently they're not, and they actually are from the west.
Yeah, they're not like considered an invasive species because that's kind of a different thing. They are still from the United States, but if you came back here in 1803 when Ohio became a state, you're not going to find a coyote. Yeah. So they're pretty new here. So, and coyotes are compared to a wolf, very small. Yeah. So they will predate on deer, but really they're only eating young deer in the springtime. They're not going to take down a full-grown deer. Yeah. So they're not regulating our deer population. Our deer population is, the biggest predator of a deer in Ohio is a car. Yeah. And if you are one of those people who have unfortunately participated in that activity, you know that that's not fun. Yeah. And underneath that are your hunters. So our hunters are keeping that deer population in check. If we didn't have hunters, our population would go crazy. You have disease outbreak, you have overgrazing. You can see in Sandusky County and any heavy agriculture county, you can see evidence of a deer population being overpopulated if you just look in those woodlots.
Look at the tree line.
And if you can see a defined line, that's not supposed to be there. That is a graze line from where the deer have eaten every leaf that they can reach or every vegetation they can reach, and that's a sign of overpopulation. So you can see those in a township or a county. You can see where there's too many deer in a certain area. So it's really important that we have our hunters on our landscape.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people, especially because I come from northeastern Ohio, and a lot of people in the more urban areas kind of are like not really as keen into hunting and don't really understand how important it actually is and how it is kind of like balancing out the populations and how that kind of works. So I'm glad that you talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
I guess kind of going sort of a different direction in terms of invasive species. I know you said the coyote is not an invasive species and stuff. What invasive species are there in Ohio, and what major concerns are there for those species? I know there's the big one that I hope you talk about, the spotted lanternfly.
Yeah. Every year, unfortunately it seems like there's another invasive species that now we have to start worrying about. And so the spotted lanternfly is one that I would say is a recent one. Like it's our most recent battle, per se, probably. And it is actually really cool, colorful.
It looks cool. I just am like, you shouldn't be here.
And they're really cool. If you don't know what they look like, definitely Google a picture of them. Also, so you know what they look like, so you can kill them and help us.
Yeah.
But they are really cool, and it's kind of a shame, as my family talks about, we're like, oh, it's kind of a shame that these aren't like helpful because they look really cool. But they are the newest kind of, or one of the newest insects to kind of come here and cause problems, and they are a huge problem for our native wildlife. But they do. From my limited understanding of them, is they cause issues for vineyards. So if you're a wine drinker, do your part and help stop the spotted lanternflies. But they will take their toll on vineyards, and so a lot of vineyards are concerned about that. But our division of forestry, and one of our other ODNR divisions, is kind of spearheading looking into how we control that. And right now we're doing our best to track them and just prevent the continued spread. They're right now, if you look at a map of where they're surrounded by big cities. So like Toledo, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, because people are accidentally spreading them.
Yeah.
So kind of like checking, if you have, and it's similar to how the emerald ash borer was spread across Ohio and across the United States, firewood, and looking and making sure that we're burning our wood locally. So if you're traveling to a different state or whatever, not taking your firewood with you and acquiring it there and burning it there, not bringing it back and forth. So checking that. And then also, like, if you see one of these guys, you want to squish it. So step on it. Literally go out and step on these spotted lanternflies. Now make sure you know what you're looking at, but they're pretty easy to identify. And squishing them, and then also reporting them, especially if you look at a map and you see that your area isn't really represented, so that we can know from a management standpoint of where we need to target management for that invasive species and stop that spread. And then they also lay their egg masses on trees, so those are a little bit trickier to identify. You kind of have to look up a picture and they're not tricky, but you wouldn't recognize them, if you just went out and looked at something on a tree. And destroying those egg masses too is really important to prevent that, cycle of breeding and things like that. But I know in Toledo, and they still don't really know why, but there is a certain building in Toledo that they're attracted to. They just will attract this one building, and I forget what building it is. It's escaping my mind. And they'll just die along the edge of this building. And there's just
that's strange,
piles of them, kind of almost similar to what you picture mayflies.
Mayflies, yeah.
It's just they're just piled on this one building, and they don't really know why, but they are attracted to one specific building in Toledo. So we're constantly dealing with new invasive species and our old invasive species, and trying to approach the management of our plant and animal invasive species.
Gotcha. So what other ones? So spotted lanternfly is the most recent battle. Zebra.
Yeah, the zebra mussels.
Zebra mussel. So I know that's a more aquatic one.
So we do. We have aquatic. We have plants. We have wildlife species. We have land species. We have all different sections and groups of where invasive species lie. And with invasive species, kind of the way that you look at them is sometimes controlling them or in very rare situations, eradicating them completely is very successful. Other times you kind of just learn that it's never going to leave, and you do your best, right? You pick and choose your battles, because some battles you're just not going to win, and you're going to waste a lot of time, money, and resources. But those zebra mussels, kind of one where, are they ever going to leave Lake Erie? No. They're here. They came here from ballast water, so in ships. They weren't, most of our invasive species brought here on accident. Just brought in through different parts of the world, bringing in on ships and cargo, whatever, what have you. But zebra mussels are probably here to stay. We just learn how to change management strategies. Other things like purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife is a very beautiful bright purple flower. And this is actually, one that was brought here on purpose, but not knowing what it would do. So this is a flower that was brought over from Europe or Asia, I'm not actually sure, maybe Asia. And brought here for landscaping. So it's a very pretty flower. We plant it, very similar to Bradford pear, or Callery pear, which we now know we don't want to plant those anymore either. But planted these flowers. They were gorgeous. They escaped, the landscaping, went out into our wetlands, and just took over all of our native species, even though it's really beautiful. Not good for our native species at all. So being aware of what you're planting, if there's a new craze of a new flower, new ornamental plant, is this going to be a good idea? Obviously you plant a marigold, it's going to die. It's not going to go. It's not going to go take over but some other ones that
can spread a lot easier.
We don't want to plant those. And so the purple loosestrife, though, does have, there are some that have a successful story. Purple loosestrife, long story short, escaped landscaping, overtook a lot of our wetlands, and then they did some research about how purple loosestrife, where it's native to, how is that managed, or what does its life cycle look like? And there's actually a beetle that eats it and controls it. So we did some research, brought beetles over, released those beetles that only, very similar to monarch and milkweed, they eat purple loosestrife just like a caterpillar. Monarch caterpillar only eats milkweed. And they targeted that, didn't cause a problem for any of our other vegetation, and they are a biological control for that invasive species. So we do have things like that, but just something to be aware of. I always say, always plant native, right? You can never go wrong with a native plant. A lot of times they're more resilient to our climate anyways because they belong here. They're providing benefits to our pollinators and different wildlife species, so they're a great option for our landscaping. And then that you're not going to down the road be part of something where like, oh shoot, I planted that 20 years ago and now this is everywhere and I didn't know and it's not your fault. But we want to avoid those. We don't want to have those situations keep coming up in our future. Yeah.
So I know you talked about that beetle that was able to help. In terms of, I guess it's different, but keystone species in Ohio, what are some of those keystone species that we have that have an impact on like biodiversity or something?
Keystone species, for those who don't know what a keystone species is they're kind of like, for lack of better words, if I can think back to my years at Ohio State, a species that is going to, if that species benefits, a lot of other species are also benefiting, or that a certain habitat is also benefiting.
But also like regulates as well.
Yes.
Too. Yeah.
Yes. They're very positive things. So when we talk about a keystone species, very positive outlook on something. And a lot of times we associate keystone species with larger species, but one of them that if you spend any time at Cedar Point or Port Clinton or Marblehead, you're really familiar with mayflies. They're great bioindicator that our lake is healthy. They're great to have. Those guys are great species that we have here.
I was actually going to ask you about mayflies because I know they're such a nuisance for people because they're like, ugh.
They're like,
but they are really useful.
Yeah,
for that.
Yeah, they're beneficial for our walleye or perch. Everything living in Lake Erie is going to feed on the larval stages of those. Another big fancy word are macroinvertebrates. They're going to feed on those larval stages of a mayfly, and very sustaining for the lake. But they also only survive in healthy water. So if it's very polluted, they are not going to be able to survive. So they're very sensitive to pollution. So if we have a great mayfly hatch that's alarming to some that like a plague is happening,
but
but
it's good.
It's good. It's great. My favorite is to just always watch the videos of the people who are not from Ohio go to Cedar Point and just like get hit with the mayflies in their faces.
Yeah, on Top Bill 2 or something.
Yeah, that's just like my favorite. I'm like, oh yeah, you picked like the wrong week of the summer to go to Cedar Point. But yeah, sorry, getting like way off track of key species and what those guys are. But we have, obviously we have our deer and our wild turkey. We have those very common species now, but they used to not be common. They were actually extirpated from Ohio in 1904. They disappeared completely. The Division of Wildlife had to reintroduce them and bring them back to the state, and reestablish them. And now those species are thriving and other species are thriving along with them. So we have species like that. Similar story with the river otter. So river otters were extirpated also early 1900s, and then the Division of Wildlife started reintroducing them. We released 123 otters that we trapped in Arkansas and Louisiana, and then brought them to Ohio and released them, and they repopulated all on their own. Mm-hmm. So we have great stories, great conservation stories, and we're not, that's not the end of the story, right? That's not book closed, over. We're doing that now with lake sturgeon is a huge one in mm-hmm. Lake Erie. We, this past fall, released the first lake sturgeon into the Sandusky River in Fremont. So hopefully in 20, 30 years, we can look back and we can see there's a new species thriving, doing well, benefiting our environment. Some other work across the state, we work with hellbenders a lot, or mm-hmm. we partner with zoos to work on hellbenders, very endangered species, and they are our largest salamander, actually. So they're aquatic, so you're not going to find them like in a woods, like where you might find another salamander, but they're an aquatic salamander, and they get massive, but they're also super sensitive to pollution. Mm-hmm. So if we have pollution, we're not going to have great hellbender habitat. Yeah. So we're working to restore those in a lot of different rivers and watersheds.
Gotcha. So I guess I know you had a lot of fun facts prepared. Yeah. Would you like to share? Would you like to take some time and share a couple of them and kind of like maybe expand on them as we're possibly closing up here?
Sure. I shared like a lot of some of my.
As you were going.
My like Great Black Swamp, pasture pigeon, like those are some of the coolest stories. The other one that we don't think of a lot too is just looking at species that were here, disappeared, and then have come back. Yeah. And beaver is another one, and they have such a cool story, because in the United States we have what's called the American beaver. And, they're a native species, native to most of the states in Canada, found all over. And when European settlers started coming, and, that whether that's French, English, they're coming to North America, United States, and Canada, they come here and they see our American beaver. And they are so excited because they see that so much potential to change their lives, essentially, because in their home country, wherever they came from, they also have a different subspecies of beaver over there. But beaver at that time is really important for what ended up being called the North American fur trade. And so they had out-trapped their beaver, or out-hunted and out-trapped their beaver mm-hmm. in their home country in Europe and Russia. And they had basically extirpated their species over there. And so they come here and like, man, this is the exact same thing that we have at home. Like, this is what we need. And so the French and the English, they started trapping. They formed a lot of treaties with Native American tribes and traded a lot. Basically, the Native Americans would trap beaver, and then they'd trade beaver pelts for guns, ammunition, cooking pots, even, things like that they had never experienced. They had never had firearms up until that point. They had just used bow and arrow. And so this is really important for both sides. And if you learn more about, American history, you see that a lot of these early relationships, these early treaties, they were formed because of one animal, because of beaver. And so a similar story to kind of the Carolina parakeet. So we think of the Carolina parakeet as, their feathers are displaying wealth. Well, if you were wealthy back then during the North American fur trade, you and a man, you had a beaver felt hat.
I was gonna say the beaver hat. The
beaver felt hat was how you showed your wealth off. And so basically, they shaved the beaver pelt down very, very fine, and it was this felt that was left. And so that was the main source of trade, was for these felt hats. And so that, like, North American fur trade was like 1500s, and that kind of started tailoring off like 1850s is kind of when that came to an end. But you had all of these people coming here for beaver, and how a lot of our states are being settled is because of trapping. And then obviously they're being inundated. The beaver population is taking its toll. They're being overtrapped. There's no regulation. And they are extirpated from Ohio by about the 1830s. They don't have great records, but sometime around the 1830s, they're pretty much considered gone. And then it's not until 100 years later, in 1936, that there's the first documented sighting of, there's a beaver back in Ohio. So that's not, we did relocate, like we trapped beavers in Ohio and moved them around a state to expand their population, but they came back on their own after we, stopped trapping them and started managing populations and creating better habitat, and that sort of thing. So they came back on their own, and beaver are thriving. They're doing super, super well. In Ohio now, and we do have a trapping season, again. And with fur bearers, there is kind of a different story to tell as far as like sales of wildlife and things. So for fur bearers like beaver, you can, and people do still sell pelts. So trappers can still trap beaver, skin and flesh the beaver, and then sell them in that fur market. And so that is still done. It's not as popular. It's not as beneficial to do it per se. A lot of people who are doing it are just traditional trappers. This is what they've done. This is part of their family history. So it's not as popular anymore. But again, like, it's just people, don't change that much when you just look at the cycle of history. There was actually a surge, and it's kind of tapering down, but there was a surge in demand for beaver in like the early 2020s. And it's because everybody's watching a show called Yellowstone.
Oh.
And cowboy hats were made out of beaver felt. So we had come full circle.
That's crazy.
Before they were making more like top hats out of beaver, but everybody's watching Yellowstone. Everybody wanted to be a cowboy. And so they started buying beaver felt hats, but they're cowboy hats. And so beaver prices see this little uptick, and everyone's like, what's going on? And it turns out everybody's wanting a cowboy hat because they want to be like Yellowstone.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, the show is going down a little bit in popularity. I think it's like not, the talk.
I think it might be like, I don't know.
I think, I haven't followed it. I know there's a lot of spin-off series, but I think it's kind of coming to a close. But you kind of see those little upticks just in what's happening in pop culture and how that affects something down to trapping beaver.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about, especially in the modern society of how pop culture is like everything. So I saw this somewhere about like there's been a couple of bear sightings lately. Is it like Ashtabula County, or am I not right about the county?
So I think within the past year or two, Ashtabula County and those like surrounding bordering counties, I think Richland County is another one that has seen a few more black bears. And black bears are still endangered in Ohio. Our records of historical black bear records aren't super fantastic, but what I've read is we've never had like huge booming population of black bears like some other states have. But we are seeing more of our black bears coming back, and they are pretty restricted to like the Pennsylvania border. So they have the habitat that they need. They have large tracts of uninterrupted forest, those types of things. So they're there. Most of our black bears we have in Ohio are what are called young transient males, which, long story short, basically means that they just graduated high school and they just got kicked out of their house by the mom, and they're like, get out of here. Go live on your own. I don't want anything.
They're going to go to one specific place, I think.
They're basically kicked out of the house. Go find somewhere to live. And because all the other bears where they came from kind of have their territory established, they're moving out into more spaces, which is pushing them out towards like that Richland, Ashland County area, the fringes of bear habitat, so to speak. And kind of what they do is they come into Ohio from Pennsylvania or West Virginia and Kentucky, and they bumble and they keep going. And then eventually they hit a line of where we have more cornfields than we do trees. And that crossover is kind of Ashland County. And then they're like, actually, we don't want to be here. And so they kind of go back to where they came from, where they go a different route, like south or something like that. Yeah. But we don't have very many breeding bears in Ohio. Yeah. We get those like ones searching for habitat.
Those like males and stuff.
Yeah. And so we've seen more of those sightings in that, like, central eastern, I guess, Ohio. I'm not sure how to describe that area of Ohio, but on that part of Ohio, we don't see that a lot in Northwest Ohio.
Yeah.
If we do see that, it's usually along the Michigan border. So same idea, but they're coming down from Michigan, and then they don't get very far into Ohio, and they're like, no, I'm good. we're done here. Like we went too far. Yeah. So we are doing a lot more research on black bears in that heavy area. Ashtabula County is where a lot of our research is being done. And we have collared and tracked several female breeding sows, so several female bears. But in early June, we actually collared a 500-pound male black bear.
That was the one that I was...
That was in Ashtabula County, we were pretty shocked to hear about a 500-pound male black bear is obviously an adult male.
Yeah.
So not like that young male looking around. So I think we're really interested to see what happens with that bear, where he ends up going, and tracking that bear, because I think that can tell us a lot more about a potential breeding population. Probably a shared population between Ohio and Pennsylvania, but that's pretty new information, because normally you think bear, you think really big, and 500 pounds, some people might be like, well, isn't that how big a bear is? Our bears in Ohio, especially our young males, are like 200 pounds maybe.
Yeah.
Like they're half the size of this bear, so they're pretty small.
That's
so to
crazy.
get a bear that big was pretty surprising, which I think a lot of folks.
Interesting. Yeah, that's crazy. And then especially, I guess, one last question before we go and stuff. Mm-hmm. So urban development and how that's kind of continuing to progress as, I guess, we evolve as a society, or however you want to word it. How does that affect species and stuff?
Yeah.
Like, it's obviously like immense,
Yeah, the biggest the biggest factor into wildlife population decline over time, looking back hundreds of years ago and today, is habitat loss. So obviously hundreds of years ago we had a lot of overhunting, but we had a crazy amount of habitat loss, and we still have habitat loss today. So that is the biggest challenge that we face overall with fish and wildlife resources, is that habitat loss. And with urban development, as you start seeing more things, whether that's farm field, whether that's a woodlot, be converted to something more urban, we face a lot of challenges there. So, and a lot of that can come down to simply what you can do yourself in your backyard, or if you live in a more rural area, what can you do with the 5 acres that maybe you have? Because we can total up, like, I forget the actual numbers, but you look at how much farm field there is and how many herbicides and pesticides are sprayed on those farmland areas, and you might think that that's a bigger number. But if you look at urban areas, that urban number is way higher. And it's way collectively, way more of an impact. And it's also kind of what I describe as like, it's not doing anything, right? Because our farmers are doing these things so they can feed us. But our urban, we just want to have a pretty grass lawn, So starting to think about, as we enter more urban development, can we start planting native species? Maybe stop fertilizing your yawn, or make sure you're not over fertilizing. Stop spraying pesticides and killing off all of our beneficial pollinators, because we might think you're spraying for mosquitoes, but you're also killing monarchs. You're killing other things too. Stuff. It's not just going to kill the one insect that you don't want. It's going to kill all of our pollinators too. So we want to think about how we can make our own little green space that we have, how we can make that wildlife friendly, whether that's planting native plants, planting milkweed, stopping our spraying of pesticides. If you have an acre or a couple acres, turning in a small corner of it into a pollinator plot, letting that grow up, letting that go wild, and establishing those little mini safe havens for our wildlife within our urban landscapes.
I talked with Black Swan Bird Observatory for the last podcast episode, and she was talking about how keeping parts of your fields that are constantly getting flooded and stuff, possibly like converting those into more wild-ish areas that can provide good habitat for like birds or other species like that. That's something that you can do.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different federal and state programs that will help pay for that or pay for it. Maybe a majority of it or completely. Those for areas that aren't going to be productive cropland because they lay too wet or it's a low spot. Yeah. You can put a buffer strip in there, you can put a riparian area in there, make wildlife habitat, get paid for it, and then you're also you're not missing out on your yield that much.
And that can help you with your operation and everything too. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else you want to add before we go?
We're celebrating 4th of July, 250 years, and so I think it's a great time to recognize what our future. We're spending a lot of time, I think, looking back on the past and how we've gotten to where we are today, but looking towards that future and what changes can we make, what small changes can we make so that the next 250 years they are beautiful and they're helping our wildlife and being part of those changes. And a lot of those changes are coming right here and happening right here in Sandusky County. So we have summer to look forward to. Get out and try something new. Go fishing for the first time, or go to a wild place that you've never been to before, or learn about planting native plants in your yard or something like that. So I always encourage people to learn something new and just share that with others, because if we didn't share it with other people, all the things that we do, we wouldn't be successful. We wouldn't have come together to create change for better.
Here's a look into Sandusky County Soil and Water's upcoming events. Keep an eye out for us at the Sandusky County Fair, as we'll be having kids' activities Monday through Thursday that week from 1 to 2 p.m. As for Zach's outreach programs, for the remainder of July, he'll be putting on 2 more Marvelous Moths programs on the 20th at 5 p.m. at Woodville Public Library and the 22nd at 5 p.m. at Burchard Public Library. In August, Zach will be putting on Dandy Dragonflies programs at 5 p.m. on the 3rd, 5th, 10th, and 12th at the Clyde, Gibsonburg, Woodville, and Burchard Public Libraries, respectively. He will also be concluding his monthly PokeCon series with his last presentation on August 6th at 5:15 p.m. at Clyde Public Library. Be sure to keep an eye out on Facebook for these programs and any more we may offer in the future. That wraps up today's episode of the One Stop Crop Podcast. We hope that you enjoyed your time with us and stay tuned for more podcast episodes in the future. If you'd like to contact us here at the office, please email us at sanduskycountyswcd@gmail.com or call us at 419-334-6324. Be sure to remember us as your one-stop shop for all things farming, conservation, and the environment here in Sandusky County, and thank you so much for listening in.